Night settles over an Ozark hillside where stones lean like old men listening to secrets. Among them rests the grave of Clark Hockensmith, a name spoken with equal measures of sorrow and unease. Some say he sensed death trailing him long before it arrived. Others whisper he walked toward it willingly. What truth lingers in those quiet shadows? Welcome, friends. Tell me where you are watching from this evening and how the night sounds where you live. If this journey into our Ozark past speaks to you, kindly subscribe. The hills remember the sound of his footsteps, though the man himself has been gone for more than a century. Clark Hockensmith was born into a corner of the Ozarks where life moved slowly, shaped by the stubborn soil and the weather's shifting temper. Families lived close to the land then, measuring years by harvests, revivals, and the steady turning of seasons. Clark's parents, like many in those hollows, were not wealthy, but were held upright by duty, faith, and the unwritten codes that governed small communities. Their cabin sat on a ridge that caught the evening wind, and neighbors recalled that the Hockensmith place always looked a little lonely, even when smoke curled from the chimney or a lantern glowed behind the window. In those early years, the rhythms of his life were simple: chores at dawn, school when he could manage it, Sunday gatherings and long silences broken only by the creak of trees in winter. Yet people would later swear that something about the boy seemed touched by shadows before he was old enough to name them. No one could fully explain it, and maybe no one ever will. Old-timers used to say the land itself shapes a child's temperament. Clark grew up where hollows swallowed sound and where dusk fell early, sliding between the hills like a second dusk behind the first. Children in such places learned early to fear the wrong kind of silence, the kind that came after a sudden stillness when birds quit their singing and even the cicadas paused as if listening to something unseen. Clark, they said, was the kind of boy who noticed these quiet stoppages. He was gentle, quiet, and observant in a way that made some neighbors uneasy. When other children chased one another through creek beds or laughed their way along wagon paths, Clark lingered behind, watching, studying the world with a seriousness much older than his years. It was not sadness that marked him, but a watchfulness that made adults lower their voices when he passed. His father worked the land with steady patience, and his mother tended to plants with the belief that everything living could flourish if spoken to kindly. But the Hockensmiths had suffered loss before Clark was old enough to remember it fully. Records from those years mention an older sibling whose grave sits beside their family plot, the date barely legible now. Some said Clark used to stand there as a small boy, touching the stone with a puzzled tenderness as though trying to understand something no one had explained to him. Whether that early grief seeped into him or whether the adults projected their own sorrow onto his nature is impossible to say. What is certain is that neighbors began to whisper, gently at first, that Clark was a boy who knew more about loss than any child should. The family seldom spoke of misfortune, but every community has its hush-spoken memories, and in later decades, people recalled that the Hockensmiths kept to themselves a little more each year. Not unfriendly, just reserved, carrying their share of life's burdens with quiet dignity. Church rolls list the family as regular attendees, and yet older parishioners insisted that Clark always sat near the back, head bowed, not shy exactly, but distant. It was as if his mind drifted elsewhere, drawn to places only he could see. When hymnals opened and voices rose, his lips moved, but made almost no sound. Some said the boy felt things deeper than others, though no one could point to proof. Others thought he simply preferred listening, to sermons, to wind, to the hum of a world that revealed itself only to those who paid attention. The Ozarks of Clark's childhood were built on stories passed from porch to porch, from fireside to field. Folklore was stitched into daily life, as natural as the call of whippoorwills. People believed in signs then, in dreams that warned of sickness, in animals that crossed one's path at the wrong moment, in the eerie stillness before a tragedy. These beliefs were not fanciful. They were cultural memory, born of harsh living and the need to understand the unknown. In such an environment, a child like Clark, quiet, perceptive, unsettled by things others did not notice, could easily become a vessel for meaning. Long before anything truly unusual happened around him, the region had already prepared a place for him in its stories. Still, not every memory of Clark carries darkness. Some recalled him sitting beside his mother on summer evenings, helping her pick beans, or listening as she recited verses from old family Bibles. Others remembered him walking barefoot along creek banks, collecting smooth stones just to feel their weight in his pockets. He was not brooding, not strange in a dangerous way, just thoughtful. Maybe too thoughtful for his own comfort. But the hills teach their children to live with solitude, and in that solitude, imagination takes root. Perhaps Clark's quietness was simply the natural expression of a boy growing up in a landscape that encouraged reflection. One story, repeated often enough to become part of the region's shared memory, tells of a night when Clark was no more than 8 or 9. His father had taken him along on an evening visit to a neighbor's. The men spoke on the porch, and Clark wandered ahead into the front yard. The moon was full, the kind that paints fences silver and makes shadows look longer than they ought to be. When his father called for him, Clark returned slowly, as though listening to something behind him. Later, his father asked what held the boy's attention. Clark answered only that he heard someone calling his name from the far side of the property. No person was there, and the men dismissed it as imagination. But Clark, the story goes, insisted the voice was real, soft, distant, and sad. Whether the tale grew with time or whether it truly happened remains uncertain, yet it became one of the earliest threads in the legend woven around his life. As Clark grew older, the memory of that night faded from daily conversation, but it lingered as a seed of something that would later be revisited with unease. Children often imagine voices after all. The hills are full of echoes that play tricks on the mind, especially at dusk. But those who recounted the story years later did so with the tone of people trying to make sense of a much larger pattern. They looked backward through the lens of tragedy, tugging at every small moment that might have meaning. And so the image of young Clark standing in a moonlit yard, listening to an unseen caller, became a symbolic beginning in the collective imagination of the community. Life carried on. Chores, seasons, church meetings, school days when weather allowed, all unfolded with the steady pulse familiar to rural families. And yet even in these ordinary rhythms, the land seemed to mark Clark with a sense of foreboding. His mother once confided to a friend, according to second-hand retellings, that her son sometimes woke at night speaking of dreams he could not recall fully. She would find him sitting upright, listening again to something no one else could hear. Whether this was true or the embellishment of later storytellers, it entered the lore surrounding his life. The community, shaped by generations of belief in omens, tucked such details away like tinder, waiting for a match. Still, nothing in those early years suggested that Clark's life would one day be told with a mixture of sorrow and mystery. He was simply a boy of the Ozarks, shaped by hills and heritage, carrying a temperament that made some uneasy and others protective. The story of his fate had not yet formed, the shadows had not yet lengthened, but sometimes, in quiet places, destiny begins with a sound too soft for most to notice. In Clark's case, it was said to be a sound he heard one autumn evening, a faint echo drifting through bare branches, carrying the same mournful tone he remembered from childhood, or believed he remembered. That sound would follow him in memory for years, though he never spoke of it in words the community understood. The faint echo that drifted through those bare branches would linger as we step into the next chapter of Clark Hockensmith's life, a quiet thread pulling us from childhood into the unsettled spaces of his early youth. That sound, whatever its origin, becomes our doorway now, carrying us into the years when Clark began to change in ways the community both noticed and misunderstood. It is said that certain moments follow a person the way the wind trails along a ridgeline, brushing their shoulder long after the source has passed. For Clark, the memory of that soft, mournful call seemed to shape the contours of the man he would slowly become. He entered adolescence during a period when the Ozarks were tightening after a string of difficult seasons. Crops failed more often than they succeeded. Men left home for weeks of work farther north, and families held their breath through long winters that felt heavier than the ones before. In such times, young people grew up quickly. Clark was no exception, though he did not harden in the way many boys did. Instead, he grew inward, adopting a seriousness that made him seem older than his years, though his body remained thin and his voice gentle. Neighbors watched him with curiosity, unsure whether his solemnity was the result of circumstance or something more private. Children of the Ozarks were no strangers to silence, yet Clark's quietness seemed to carry an added weight. Teachers noted his attentiveness, but also his distance. He answered questions easily enough, but often seemed preoccupied, his gaze drifting toward windows or doorways, as though pulled by something beyond the room. Many remembered him sitting alone during recess, tracing shapes in the dirt, or watching the clouds move across the sky with an intensity that unsettled other boys. In small communities, difference draws attention whether justified or not, and soon Clark was the subject of murmured remarks from other parents who wondered what made him so intent, so unhurried, so unlike the rest. Some attributed his habits to the early loss of a sibling, claiming grief had soaked into him like rain into limestone. Others believed he inherited his mother's sensitive spirit. But as the years passed, another explanation began to surface. Not from malice, but from the way stories grow like wild vines in places where superstition clings to the living world. A few insisted that Clark had what they called the watchful eyes, a phrase that referred to children who seemed to sense misfortune before it arrived. In the Ozarks, such a reputation was not entirely unwelcome. It mingled with respect, fear, and curiosity in equal measure. Yet for a boy still trying to understand himself, it carried a quiet burden. This perception began, according to later accounts, when Clark was 12 or perhaps 13. The exact age varies depending on the teller, but the essence of the story remains consistent. A neighbor's mule had gone missing after a stormy night, and the family spent 2 days searching the woods and creek beds with no success. Clark, upon hearing of it, reportedly stood still for several moments, then pointed toward a hollow dense with underbrush and said they would find it near the water. The men found the animal the next day fallen into a wash along a narrow branch of the creek. It could have been coincidence. Perhaps Clark knew the mule favored that area, but in a land shaped by old beliefs, no one took the matter lightly. Word spread quietly. Some dismissed it as chance, others as luck. Yet in the small cracks of conversation where people confide their unease, the idea settled. Clark had a way of knowing things. Whether this belief grew from genuine occurrences or from the community's need to place meaning on an otherwise simple event, it began to solidify into a local narrative. People started watching Clark more closely. They studied the way he paused before answering questions, the way his eyes drifted toward distant hills, even when standing among others. And though Clark himself said nothing to encourage such talk, silence often speaks louder than words. There were other moments too, subtle ones that only became significant when viewed in retrospect. A girl from a neighboring family fell ill unexpectedly, and days before it happened, Clark had asked her brother if she was feeling all right, though she had shown no obvious signs of sickness. A storm uprooted a large oak near the schoolhouse, and Clark, having seen the tree earlier that morning, told a friend it looked tired. an odd phrase that became chilling only after the trunk split hours later. None of these incidents were dramatic enough to warrant public alarm, but each added another small stone to the pile of stories forming at his feet. Clark never commented on these coincidences. If anything, those close to him sensed they troubled him more than they intrigued him. His mother later recalled that he often looked weary, as though carrying worries too large for his narrow shoulders. When pressed, he would say only that he dreamed strange things or felt a heaviness he could not name. Dreams were taken seriously in those hills. They were considered warnings or messages, particularly when the dreamer was young. But Clark's reluctance to speak of them only deepened the mystery around him. Some wondered if he feared being misunderstood. Others whispered that he feared being believed. The newspapers of that era mentioned nothing about these quiet matters, for such things lived outside the realm of official record. Yet the oral history is consistent. Clark was a boy who watched the world too closely, and in a place where every shadow carries a story, that alone was enough to kindle unease. Still, no one treated him with cruelty. The Ozarks, for all its superstitions, has always valued kinship. Neighbors helped one another, shared food, offered prayers, and mended fences without expecting payment. Within this fabric of communal life, Clark was held with a kind of cautious affection. People liked him. They simply did not fully understand him. But adolescence is a restless period, and as Clark entered his later teenage years, the sense of quiet foreboding seemed to sharpen. Several people recalled that he grew jumpier, more easily startled by sudden noises. He would turn his head abruptly at distant sounds, even when no one else heard them. He developed a habit of scanning the tree line before stepping outdoors at night, as though searching for something he expected to see. When asked, he would shrug and say he just liked knowing what was out there. But more than one person noted the tension in his shoulders as he spoke, suggesting that Clark was not merely cautious, he was afraid. Fear in young people often has a source, though not always an obvious one. Some believed he carried unresolved grief. Others suspected he feared the talk circulating about him. But a few elders later speculated that Clark felt watched by something he could not articulate. They described him as a boy who moved as though listening for an echo no one else could hear. And in a land where death was a familiar visitor, where families buried loved ones in hillside plots within sight of their homes, such a feeling was not dismissed lightly. The Ozarks did not scoff at invisible burdens. They had lived with too many of their own. It was around this time, midway through his adolescence, that Clark's temperament began shaping the beginnings of a reputation that would follow him into adulthood. Folks would gather on porches after a day's work, the low orange glow of kerosene lamps flickering against the settling dark, and someone would mention the strange Hockensmith boy. Not unkindly, but with a mix of curiosity and hesitance. They spoke of his sensitivity, his odd comments, his stillness that bordered on eerie. They wondered, quietly, what made him so different. And though no one claimed anything supernatural then, the foundation had been laid. Years later, many would look back on that period as the time when Clark first seemed touched by something beyond understanding. But for now, he was simply a boy walking home at dusk, listening to the whisper of branches overhead, still haunted by the memory of a sound he heard long ago. Soft, mournful, and somehow familiar. That sound waited for him in the quiet of every evening, a lingering presence that neither faded nor explained itself, shaping the edges of his days in ways he could never fully describe. The soft, lingering presence of that sound, half memory, half omen, follows us now into the years when Clark Hockensmith would come face to face with death for the first time in a way no one could ignore. It was not unusual, in those days, for families in the Ozarks to shoulder tragedy early. Illness, accidents, the long reach of poverty, and the rawness of the land made grief a familiar visitor. But what set Clark's experience apart was not the tragedy itself, but the way people later came to interpret it, reshaping simple misfortune into something unnervingly prophetic. Clark was in his mid-teens when the event occurred, old enough to work alongside grown men, young enough that boyhood still clung to him in quiet ways. That summer had been blistering hot, the kind of heat that buckles fence posts and leaves the creeks so low their stones sit exposed like old bones bleaching in the sun. Families rose before dawn to finish chores before the heat settled, and many retreated indoors through the long afternoons when even the cicadas seemed weary. It was during this season that an illness swept through several homesteads to the east of the Hockensmith place. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make the newspapers, just the sort of mild fever that appeared every few years and passed through families unevenly. Clark's family was not immune. His father became sick first, then recovered within a week. His mother grew pale and tired, but the fever never fully gripped her. And then came the neighbor boy, one of Clark's few companions, a boy named Elias, who lived a short walk down the ridge. Some said he and Clark had grown close in recent months, sharing the quiet understanding that comes naturally to young people who are not quite like their peers. Others said their friendship was little more than convenience. But records and recollections agree that Clark visited Elias often that summer, helping him with chores during his recovery. The first brush with death began quietly. Elias seemed to improve at first, the fever fading and color returning to his cheeks. But the illness changed course with startling swiftness. Within 2 days, he deteriorated sharply, and by the third morning, his breathing had grown shallow. Clark had been there the evening before, bringing fresh water and sitting beside him in a silence that was neither awkward nor heavy. Just the kind of silence shared by boys who rarely needed words. According to Elias's mother, Clark behaved strangely that night. She later told others that he stood in the doorway for a long time before leaving, staring at the boy as though memorizing his face. When she asked if something was wrong, he only replied that he felt the room was too quiet. The phrase meant little at the time. Death rooms often were quiet, with the air thickened by worry and whispered prayers. But after the boy passed in the early hours of the next morning, that comment began to take on an unsettling significance. People remembered it, they repeated it, and like all things repeated in uncertain times, it grew. For Clark, the loss struck deeply. He did not speak of it publicly, though several neighbors mentioned he looked drawn in the days that followed. He walked the ridge path slower than usual, his shoulders slightly hunched, as though weighted by something he could not set down. Those who saw him at church said his eyes looked haunted, fixed somewhere far past the pulpit. It was not unusual for a boy his age to grieve, but the manner of his sorrow, quiet, contained, almost anticipatory, caused people to whisper that Clark had somehow known what was coming. Whether that was true depended on whom you asked. Clark's mother insisted her son mourned in the same tender way he approached everything. Others felt he behaved like someone who had been waiting for the inevitable, and a small but growing number believed he sensed a presence in the room that night, something unseen by others. They tied this belief to earlier stories, his comment about the dying oak, his strange questions about the neighbor girl's health, and especially the tale of the voice he claimed to hear as a child. Patterns began to form where none may have existed. In isolated communities, patterns are powerful things. They bring comfort in times of chaos and explanation in moments of fear. And so the death of Elias became the first major shadow cast across Clark's reputation. It marked the beginning of what some later called his dark knowing, a phrase that blended superstition with sorrow. Yet to tell the story honestly, the facts remain simple. A boy fell ill, worsened suddenly, and died. Clark grieved him, nothing more. But the Ozarks has a way of holding tightly to details that depart from the expected, and Clark's solemnness in the aftermath fanned the embers of local speculation. A few weeks after the funeral, Clark was seen sitting by a small spring not far from his family's homestead. The area was shaded by tall sycamores, their leaves drifting like pale coins across the surface of the water. A man passing along the path noticed Clark sitting there, elbows on his knees, staring into the rippling pool with a look the man would later describe as too old for a boy that young. When the man asked what he was doing, Clark reportedly answered, "Listening." The man, assuming he meant the water, nodded and walked on. But years later, when recounting the story, he said the boy's expression suggested he was listening for something else entirely. Moments like this fed the growing sense that Clark carried a sensitivity uncommon, even in a region where many paid close attention to signs and omens. Some believed he was gifted, others cursed. But in the eyes of most, he was simply a boy grappling with a grief that carried an echo deep enough to reach the edges of those around him. That echo, faint but unmistakable, became one of the earliest threads in the larger tapestry of myth that would later envelop his life. The newspapers from that decade contain only a brief notice of Elias's death, a simple line noting the passing of a young neighbor boy known for his good nature. Nothing in the print hints at the fear or fascination that would later circle Clark. The silence of the record stands in stark contrast to the volume of oral recollections that spread through the community in the years to come. But this is often the case with rural history. The official documents capture the facts, while the truth of how events felt, how they were lived, feared, interpreted, endures only in the words of the people who remembered them. The grief of that summer settled over Clark like a thin veil, one that did not darken him entirely, but muted something in his once curious nature. He became more withdrawn, spending more time walking alone along the bluff trails or sitting in the shade behind the family home, staring at nothing in particular. He still did his chores, still attended services, still helped his father in the fields, but his presence felt dimmed. And while his family accepted this as the natural process of mourning, others whispered that Clark had taken the death too personally, as though he believed himself responsible for sensing what others could not. There was, however, one detail that recurred consistently in later retellings. Clark reportedly made a single statement after the burial, said not to his parents or to any adult, but to an acquaintance his own age. Sitting on a fallen log overlooking the dry creek bed, he murmured that, "Some things come in pairs." The boy who heard this comment did not understand it and thought little of it at the time. Only decades later, after other misfortunes touched Clark's life, did he repeat the story, claiming it had always troubled him that Clark seemed to be waiting for another death. Was this simply the bleak reflection of a grieving youth, or the first flicker of a belief that death had begun circling him? The truth is impossible to know, but that small remark would echo faintly in the background of every story told about Clark afterward, gaining weight with each new tragedy. For now, the first brush with death had passed, leaving behind a quiet ache that would never fully fade. But the Ozarks seldom allows grief to remain an isolated event. In places where families live close to the land and closer still to one another, sorrow has a way of spreading its roots through the soil, touching the lives of those who least expect it. Clark could not have known then that Elias's passing would mark only the first of several losses that people would later tie, fairly or unfairly, to his presence. And somewhere, in the evenings that followed, when the wind slipped between the trees and the darkness settled early across the ridge, that soft, mournful sound, the one Clark had heard since childhood, seemed to return, reminding him that grief is rarely a single moment. It is a shadow that lengthens slowly, reaching places we hoped it would never touch. The shadow of that first loss lingered across the ridge for months, softening only when the seasons finally shifted and the chill of winter gave way to the slow stirring of spring. Yet even as life resumed its usual rhythms, the memory of Elias's death clung to Clark Hockensmith in ways that shaped how the community viewed him. It is in these years that the beginnings of the Hockensmith reputation took root, quietly at first, then steadily, until his name became entangled with sorrow in a way no one could fully explain. To understand the weight this reputation placed upon him, we must look not for grand events or dramatic confrontations, but for the subtle gestures, the passing remarks, and the unspoken fears that knitted themselves together into something larger than the truth. By the time Clark reached young adulthood, he had grown into a capable worker, lean and steady, with hands hardened by years of helping his father and tending the land. He had none of the flamboyance or easy confidence of boys who sought their futures elsewhere. He stayed close to home, doing the work expected of him, keeping to modest routines. Yet wherever he went, a certain hush seemed to accompany him, as though people instinctively quieted when he stepped into a room or approached a gathering. Not out of hostility. Clark had never provoked an argument in his life, but from an undercurrent of unease formed by memories people did not discuss openly. He was known for walking long distances on foot, often at odd hours. A neighbor remembered seeing him at dusk, standing motionless at the top of a hill, staring out across the valley as though searching for something he could not name. Another saw him near the riverbank long after dark, sitting with his knees drawn close, watching the water slip past without stirring a leaf. These sightings grew common enough that people began to speak of them indirectly, in the way rural communities sometimes address uncomfortable subjects. They did not accuse or gossip openly, but they shared small remarks. "Saw Clark again last night. Boy sure keeps to himself. Reckon he's thinking on something heavy." And gradually these small remarks began to shape the collective understanding of who he was. Still, Clark was neither recluse nor ghost. He worked with local men during fence-mending seasons, traveled into town for supplies, and sometimes joined others on communal tasks like clearing storm-fallen trees or hauling lumber. But even in company, he seemed slightly apart, as though moving at a different rhythm. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, his words were measured, thoughtful, tinged with a seriousness that made laughter fade for a moment. Some admired his calmness, describing him as steady as oak. Others found his presence unsettling, claiming he observed things too closely, watched too intently, answered questions with a stillness that felt too heavy. It was during this period that a second misfortune linked to Clark began circulating in local conversation. It started with a simple accident. A farmhand from a nearby property died while felling a tree, a tragic but not uncommon occurrence in those days. But people recalled that Clark had encountered the man earlier that morning. The two had exchanged a few words at a crossroads, nothing more than a greeting and a comment about the weather. Yet someone later overheard Clark saying that the man looked tired in the eyes. It was an innocent remark, the kind people make without thinking, but after the fatal accident, that line spread quickly, carried from porch to porch, until it took on a meaning far beyond what Clark intended. Soon it was said, incorrectly, but persuasively, that Clark had sensed something amiss. Some insisted he had spoken the remark in a grave tone, as though predicting trouble. Others swore he had paused before parting, giving the man a strange look. Most of these details emerged only after the accident, molded by the human impulse to reconcile coincidence with intuition. Still, they served to strengthen the growing reputation that Clark possessed a kind of second sight. And although no one confronted him directly, the whispers deepened. People began to watch his reactions more closely, reading significance into every comment, every hesitation, every glance toward the horizon. Clark, for his part, carried these whispers unknowingly at first. He continued his routines, unaware of how his words were interpreted. But gradually he began to sense the shift, not in overt ways, but in the quiet changes that ripple through the fabric of a close-knit community. People paused a little longer before responding to him. Some avoided meeting his eyes. A few, especially elders with strong beliefs in omens and signs, treated him with a wary respect, as though he carried fragile knowledge they preferred not to encounter too directly. Clark felt the distance, but did not understand it fully. He only knew that conversations seemed shorter, gatherings quieter, and friends fewer. What troubled him more deeply, though he rarely admitted it, was how often death seemed to thread its way into the edges of his life. He did not cause misfortune, nor did he seek it, but he could not ignore how frequently he found himself on the periphery of tragedies. A cousin far removed died unexpectedly. A traveling salesman he once shared a bench with drowned in a swollen creek weeks later. A family whose home he helped repair lost an infant during the winter cold. None of these events had anything to do with him, yet because he had crossed paths with the individuals involved, the stories accumulated like stones piled upon one another. This pattern, real or imagined, shaped the core of the growing legend. People began to say that Clark was a step ahead of sorrow or followed by a long shadow. These were not accusations, merely attempts to articulate discomfort. Folklore often begins in such attempts, born not from malice but from the desire to understand the inexplicable. The Ozarks, with its deep-rooted traditions and reverence for unseen forces, provided fertile ground for such interpretations. In a community accustomed to reading signs in animal tracks, weather changes, and the behavior of birds, it did not take much for Clark's quiet demeanor and unfortunate coincidences to become woven into something more mythic. Newspaper records from that era mention Clark only in passing. References to his presence at community events, listings of his contributions to church repair work, notes about his participation in seasonal harvesting crews. Nothing in print suggests oddity or suspicion. Official documents portray him as an ordinary young man living an unremarkable rural life. But oral memory often moves faster and deeper than ink. It travels along ridges, passes through kitchen windows, lodges in the corners of barns, and it lingers long after the facts fade. Though Clark sensed the distance growing around him, he did not resent it. He had never sought attention, good or bad. If anything, he leaned further into quietness, preferring solitary walks along the old logging trails or spending evenings whittling small bits of wood into shapeless forms. His father, noticing his son's introspection, once asked if something was troubling him. Clark replied only that he felt out of step, as though the world moved around him in a rhythm he could not quite follow. His father, a practical man, attributed this to the restlessness of youth, but his mother suspected something deeper, watching Clark with the soft gaze of a woman who understood sadness without needing explanations. Around this time, another story emerged, one that, while small, became central to Clark's developing reputation. A child from a nearby farm fell ill suddenly, and Clark, upon hearing the news, walked several miles to check on the family. When he arrived, he found the child feverish but stable. Yet Clark did not stay long. He stood beside the bed, looked quietly at the child, and whispered that the room felt thin. The remark unsettled the mother, though she did not say so then. The child recovered within days, but the phrase remained with her, and she later repeated it to others. Soon the story grew twisted. Some claimed Clark had predicted the child's death. Others insisted he had sensed a spirit lingering near the bed. None of these versions matched the original moment, but once again, perception overshadowed truth. The Hockensmith reputation was no longer a collection of isolated comments. It had become a quiet current beneath daily life, shaping how people interpreted every interaction with Clark. And yet, as with many legends, the foundation was not built on supernatural events, but on the subtle discomfort of witnessing a young man who seemed burdened by emotions he could not articulate. This period of Clark's life, though marked by nothing extraordinary in the factual record, became the hinge on which his future reputation would swing. For in the Ozarks, reputations once formed can cling to a person like bark to a tree, deepening with age until even the person beneath struggles to separate himself from the stories told about him. And it is here, on the edge of his adulthood, with the shadow of sorrow trailing his steps and the whispers of neighbors deepening into quiet certainty, that a distant figure is said to have been seen walking away from Clark one evening, an ordinary man, passing traveler, but one whose fate would soon fold itself into Clark's story in a way no one expected. The distant figure walking away into the fading light would linger in the corners of Clark Hockensmith's memory, though he likely never knew that others would later speak of that moment as if it marked the beginning of a shift in him. Whether or not the traveler meant anything at all is lost to time. What remains is the sense that something subtle changed in Clark after that period, a tightening in his expression, a kind of inward tremor he concealed beneath routine. By the time he entered full adulthood, the murmur about him had grown into a quiet, persistent undercurrent. Clark was a man who feared something he could not name. And in the Ozarks, where fears were often tied to dark woods, wandering spirits, and the sharp edge of fate, people began to wonder what it was he sensed pressing against the borders of his life. Clark was in his early 20s when the unease began to show outwardly. His family's small homestead had become less a place of childhood memory and more a place of refuge. He spent long hours working the fields, mending fences or cutting wood, each motion carried out with mechanical precision. Yet neighbors noted that he paused more often now, stopping mid-task to listen to something distant. Sometimes it was a sound, a faint stirring in the woods, the crack of a branch, a whisper of wind through leaves. Other times it was something internal, a flicker of apprehension that crossed his features before he forced it away. Folks began to describe him as jumpy, though not in a nervous or reckless way. It was a deeper kind of tension, as though he expected something to step out of the dark at any moment. Not everyone saw this in him. Some still viewed Clark as a quiet, hard-working man, shaped by the land and the hardships that accompanied it. But those who paid attention, his mother, a handful of close neighbors, a couple of older men in town, noticed the change. He had become more introspective, less willing to linger in conversation, more inclined to retreat into silence even when surrounded by others. The stories from his adolescence, once considered little more than odd coincidences, began resurfacing in whispers. People recalled the remarks he had made about the mule, the dying boy, the tree that split during a storm. They remembered how he used to stop in mid-step to stare into the distance, and how a troubling heaviness entered his voice whenever death was mentioned. These memories, retold and reshaped with each repetition, began constructing a fragile mythology around him. Clark's greatest worry, though he would never have said it aloud, was not the talk itself, but the feeling that he was somehow at the center of something beyond his understanding. What that something was, he could not name, but he felt the weight of it in subtle ways, in the way animals occasionally skittered away from him, in the stillness that seemed to settle when he entered a room, in the strange dreams that visited him during the long winter nights. Those dreams, described only once to his mother, left him rattled. He dreamed of walking through a forest where every tree leaned toward him, their branches forming an arch that blocked his path. He told her the air felt thick, as though filled with unspoken warnings. She urged him not to dwell on dreams, yet she held the memory of his troubled expression long after the moment passed. There were also small incidents, isolated but memorable, that fed into the growing sense that Clark had begun to fear the shape of his own life. One neighbor recounted seeing him freeze on a path when a crow swooped overhead, his eyes fixed on the bird with a look the neighbor described as startled recognition. Another recalled Clark stepping back sharply from a child who had reached to touch his arm, as though caught off guard by the simple innocence of the gesture. When asked about these moments, Clark brushed them off, blaming fatigue or distraction, but those who witnessed them remembered the fear in his eyes. Fear, in a man like Clark, carried its own kind of power. People interpreted it differently depending on their own experiences. Some pitied him, believing he was weighed down by a sorrow he hadn't learned to shake. Others believed his fear confirmed their suspicion that Clark sensed things they could not. Perhaps warnings, perhaps spirits, perhaps the subtle tremors of impending misfortune. A few whispered that he was marked, not cursed necessarily, but gently followed by a force that lingered just past the edge of visibility. Whether they meant fate, intuition, or something more supernatural, they never said plainly. In communities shaped by folklore, such meanings often remained unspoken, lingering in the spaces between words. Clark himself tried to push back against the creeping dread. He accepted work that took him farther from home, believing distance might clear his thoughts. He helped repair barns, split cordwood, unloaded supplies from passing wagons. His willingness to toil earned him respect, and some even insisted that Clark was as reliable as they came, steady, hardworking, trustworthy. But beneath that reliability, a faint, persistent anxiety persisted. He checked over his shoulder more often now. He slept lightly, waking at the slightest sound. And on more than one occasion, his mother found him outside in the middle of the night, staring into the darkness as though expecting someone or something to emerge. The first time she asked what troubled him, he answered only, "I feel like something's coming." When she pressed him, he shook his head and retreated into silence. But the sentence stayed with her. She repeated it to a relative, who repeated it to a friend, and soon it became one of the cornerstones of the stories that would later define him. Clark Hockensmith feared his own shadow. A pivotal moment came during a church service one autumn. As the congregation sang a hymn, Clark stood among them, his voice barely audible. A woman later recalled that he seemed distracted, glancing toward the open doorway several times. After the service ended, he stepped outside abruptly, almost violently, drawing the attention of several onlookers. He stood on the steps, breathing heavily, staring out at the quiet road as if expecting to see someone waiting. When a man asked what was wrong, Clark answered only, "Nothing you'd believe." He walked away before the man could ask more. That moment, and the cryptic words that accompanied it, spread through the congregation like smoke. People talked about it for weeks, not with mockery, but with a kind of hushed seriousness that bordered on fear. By this time, Clark's internal struggle had become visible enough that even those who dismissed the superstitions surrounding him began to admit that something weighed heavily on the young man. Whether it was guilt, premonition, grief, or mental exhaustion, no one knew. But his quiet was no longer seen as mere temperament. It had sharpened into a deeper kind of solitude. People began to describe him as a man carrying a shadow on his back. And in a region where shadows often took on symbolic meaning, the phrase carried weight. Clark's fear deepened most noticeably during the nights. He avoided long, solitary walks after dark, something he once found comforting. He kept lanterns burning longer. He grew sensitive to small sounds, the low hoot of an owl, the breaking of a twig, the rustle of dry grass. His mother once asked if he thought someone was following him. Clark hesitated a long moment before saying, "Not someone." It was a troubling answer, and though he refused to elaborate, it added another small thread to the tapestry of rumors surrounding his life. Some believed Clark feared the stories about him. Others believed he feared becoming the fulfillment of them. And a few suspected he feared something far more personal. Something he sensed drawing near, but could not outrun. That autumn, a distant rumble of thunder rolled through the hills, the sky darkening in a way that made the horizon seem closer than usual. Clark stood outside his home, watching the storm approach with a look of resignation rather than apprehension. In that moment, a neighbor passing on horseback glanced toward him and saw something in his expression that unsettled her deeply. A look that suggested Clark wasn't merely afraid of what was coming, but expecting it. She rode on, glancing back only once, and saw him raise his head slightly, as though listening to a sound only he could hear. The wind carried her away quickly, yet she never forgot the image of Clark standing there in the half-light, bracing himself against a fear he could neither name nor escape. And when the storm finally broke, rain pounding the fields, lightning flashing through the hollows, it brought with it an omen that Clark would interpret in a way no one else did, an omen that would mark the beginning of the bad year that lay ahead. The storm that broke over the hills that night opened the door to a year people would later call the bad one, though at the time no one knew how far its reach would extend. Rain hammered the ridge and rattled the windows of the Hockensmith home. The wind tore at the eaves with a ferocity that made the boards groan. Lightning split the sky again and again, illuminating the trees in stark flashes that revealed their bent, shuddering forms before plunging the land back into darkness. Clark stood on the small porch as the first sheets of rain fell, his shirt plastered to his skin, his eyes fixed on a point deep within the storm, as if seeking meaning in its violence. Those who later asked him what he saw that night would never receive a clear answer, but the fact remained. The storm marked the beginning of a cascade of hardship that would spread through the region, and many who lived through it claimed that Clark sensed its arrival long before anyone else heard the first rumble. When morning came, the storm had passed, but its aftermath was clear. Trees lay scattered like discarded sticks along the creek beds. Wagons struggled through mud that clung to wheels in thick coils. Roofs leaked, fields flooded, and livestock huddled near fences with an unease that seemed to mirror their owners' dread. But storms were a part of Ozark life, and though the damage was troublesome, it was not unusual. What made that year the bad one was not the storm itself, but everything that followed it. The sickness, the accidents, the strange losses that seemed to pile upon the region with relentless determination. The first misfortune struck a family 2 miles from the Hockensmith place. Their eldest daughter fell ill with a fever that worsened quickly. Doctors were scarce, and remedies were little more than hopeful attempts. Within days, the girl passed. No one connected Clark to this tragedy at the time. He had not been near the family in weeks, but the string of misfortunes had begun, and the second came before the sorrow of the first had time to settle. A man from town, someone Clark had worked alongside during the previous summer, was thrown from his horse on a rocky stretch of road. He suffered severe injuries and died 3 days later. It was a cruel accident, one that required no explanation beyond the unpredictability of horses and the dangers of uneven trails. Yet because Clark had known him, because Clark's name surfaced in conversations about the man's past work, the whisper that Clark had been nearby began to germinate in the darker corners of community talk. The third misfortune came in late spring. A fire consumed the barn of a family who had been close acquaintances of the Hockensmiths. Though no lives were lost, the destruction devastated them. And again, someone mentioned that Clark had passed near their property only hours before the blaze broke out. There was no suggestion that he had caused it, but the pattern, formed entirely in hindsight, began taking shape beneath the surface of conversation. By the time the fourth hardship struck, a stillbirth in a neighboring household, the community had begun collecting these events like beads on a string, each one threaded with Clark's name, even if his connection to them was tenuous at best. None of this was fair. None of it reflected his character. But in a landscape where folklore was as firmly rooted as the cedars, such associations grew quietly, spreading from porch talk to kitchen table whispers. Clark himself felt the weight of the year in a different way. He could not have known how many people had begun linking his presence to the misfortunes, but he felt the sorrow piling around him, layering itself onto his mind like silt carried downstream. And he began to dread each knock on the door, each visitor who brought news. Sometimes he woke in the night with a tightness in his chest, convinced something around him was shifting in the dark. His mother grew concerned, but Clark brushed aside her questions with weary explanations. Bad dreams, restless sleep, the stress of long days. But the truth was deeper than fatigue. Clark had begun noticing something peculiar, something that unsettled him far more than the tragedies themselves. He sensed a pattern, not in the sequence of events, but in the way they seemed to announce themselves to him. Once, while repairing a wagon wheel with a neighbor, he paused suddenly, staring into the forest with such intensity that the man beside him asked if he had seen a wild animal. Clark shook his head but could not shake the feeling that something had shifted in the air. Later that evening, they learned of the accident involving the horseman. Clark said nothing about the moment he had sensed earlier, but the memory dug into him, widening his unease. Another time, he woke with the strange certainty that something was wrong near the river. He walked there before dawn and found nothing but mist rising from the water. Later that afternoon, the family who lived near the river lost their barn to the fire. Clark tried to dismiss the coincidence, but he could not. The echo of worry that had pressed on his heart that morning felt too similar to the heaviness he remembered from other tragedies that year, and from the death of Elias seasons before. Fear crept deeper into him. Not fear of the people around him, nor fear of the misfortunes themselves, but fear of what he felt inside, a growing suspicion that he sensed the tremors of sorrow before they broke through the surface of life. It weighed on him like a burden he had never asked for, something he could neither name nor escape. And as the year pressed on, his behavior changed in ways people began to notice. He kept to himself more, avoided gatherings, and grew quiet even around his parents. He lingered at the edges of working groups rather than standing among them, and when he thought no one was watching, he sometimes pressed his palms to his temples as if trying to quiet thoughts pressing too tightly against him. When neighbors saw these moments, they misinterpreted them. To them, Clark looked troubled, as if carrying guilt or dread or something darker. And their unspoken suspicions began to take shape, that Clark feared something that followed him, something that walked close enough for him to sense, but too far for others to see. By midsummer, the bad year had become a shared experience across the region. Families grew weary from worry, from illness, from spreading anxiety. The land itself seemed restless. Crop failures became common. Livestock grew skittish, refusing to settle near water. Storms arrived unannounced, rolling through the hollows like dark warnings. It was as though the hills themselves brooded beneath heavy clouds. And in such an atmosphere, stories gathered quickly. Stories of omens, of unexplained animal behavior, of dreams that woke people in the night. Clark moved through these months like a man bracing against invisible blows. Once, when a friend asked him if he felt all right, Clark answered with an uncharacteristic honesty, "I feel like the air is warning me." The friend, unsettled by those words, shared the comment with another, and soon it passed through the region like a secret too heavy to keep. Then people began repeating another statement Clark supposedly made, though it is unclear whether he ever spoke it. "This year is not done with me yet." By the time autumn arrived, the bad year had left its mark on nearly every household. But the sorrow that touched Clark most directly came when an elderly woman he often assisted, someone he had carried firewood to, repaired fences for, and helped through winters, passed unexpectedly. He had visited her only 2 days before. When he heard the news, he did not cry. He simply walked home slowly, as though confirming something he had already known. The neighbor who watched him cross the ridge said that Clark looked like a man who had finally heard the thing he'd been waiting to hear. The losses continued into early winter, and the stories about Clark deepened accordingly. People wondered aloud whether he carried misfortune with him, whether he sensed it before others did, or whether he was simply caught in the tide of a year that tested everyone. But in private, some whispered darker thoughts, that Clark Hockensmith was marked in a way the rest of them were not, and that the bad year had revealed something they had only dared to speculate about before. What they did not know, what Clark himself barely understood, was that he had begun to sense another shift brewing, a pressure building around him in the cold air. It felt like the heaviness that comes before snow when the world grows quiet and expectant. Something was drawing closer, and Clark feared it more deeply than any misfortune that had come before. One night, he stood outside beneath a moon filtered by thin clouds, the frost glinting on the ground like scattered shards of glass. He closed his eyes and listened, searching for the familiar sound that had haunted him since childhood. When it came, soft, mournful, drifting through the trees, Clark understood without knowing how that the bad year had not been the storm itself, but only the warning. The soft, mournful sound drifting through the trees, that winter night marked the quiet threshold into a chapter Clark Hockensmith would never fully escape. By then, the bad year had carved itself deeply into the memory of every family along the ridge, but its toll on Clark had been different, less visible to others, more corrosive to his inner life. And in the weeks that followed, something began to shift in him, subtle at first, then unmistakable to anyone who observed him closely. He carried himself like a man listening for a voice he dreaded to hear, and though he tried to move forward with the rhythms of daily work, there was a gravity in his expression that made people wonder whether the bad year had changed him permanently. It was around this time that the story of Clark's dark prediction entered local memory. The phrase itself did not exist then. It grew only in later retellings. But the moment at its center, what Clark said, where he said it, and how it was interpreted, became one of the most lasting and unsettling parts of the legend that formed around him. The truth behind it is tangled, because accounts varied depending on who told the story, and each generation embroidered the memory with its own anxieties. Still, within those layers, a core remains. Clark spoke words that people believed were not just reflections of fear, but glimpses into the future. The event occurred during late winter, when the air carried the brittle sharpness of cold that bites deeply into the lungs. Snow had fallen lightly the night before, just enough to leave a thin crust along the rooftops and to whiten the narrow paths between homesteads. Clark was helping a neighbor chop wood that morning, something he did often without being asked, when he paused mid-swing, lowering the axe and staring into the distance as though he had suddenly remembered something important. The neighbor, noticing the stillness, asked if he needed to rest. Clark did not respond immediately. He leaned against the handle of the axe, eyes fixed on a point beyond the ridge, the muscles in his jaw tightening. Then he said, in a voice low enough that the neighbor had to step closer to hear him clearly, "This year will take one more from me." The neighbor felt a shiver crawl across his skin, though the cold alone could not explain it. He asked Clark what he meant, but Clark only shook his head, as if regretting the words even as he spoke them. The neighbor pressed again, asking who he believed would die. Clark's answer was quiet, worn, and not at all the dramatic proclamation the later folklore made it out to be. He said only, "I don't know, I only feel it coming." Whether he truly felt something or was simply exhausted from months of sorrow and dread is impossible to say. But the neighbor, shaken by the moment, repeated the story to his wife, who repeated it to her sister, and within days the sentence had traveled across the valley. And as people heard it, the story grew. Some changed the wording slightly. Others claimed Clark was trembling when he spoke. A few insisted he described a shadow following him, or a voice calling his name, though such details show clear signs of embellishment. The earliest tellings, those closest to the moment itself, agree on one thing. Clark believed another death was coming and that he would feel its blow personally. This belief unsettled the region in ways that are difficult to fully capture now. The Ozarks was a place where death was familiar, but predictions of death carried an aura of danger. Not because people feared the one who made them, but because they feared the possibility that he might be right. Those who heard the story felt torn between skepticism and dread. Some dismissed Clark's words as the ramblings of a grief-stricken young man, overwhelmed by the tragedies of the past year. Others believed he had developed an uncanny sense for misfortune, a sensitivity rooted in his past experiences. But a small number, those who remembered stories of the voice in childhood, the mule, the sick boy, the barn fire, felt certain that Clark had tapped into something beyond ordinary intuition. Clark, meanwhile, regretted the moment almost immediately. He had spoken too openly, revealed too much of what pressed upon him. The fear that had been gnawing at him quietly for months finally slipped into words, and once spoken, those words took on a life of their own. He tried to reassure himself that it had been nothing more than exhaustion, an emotional release brought on by a long year, but the heaviness inside him did not lift. If anything, the act of speaking made the feeling stronger, more defined. And though he tried to carry on as though nothing had changed, he could not shake the sense that something in his life had begun counting down. Not long after his remark, people began watching Clark more closely, as though waiting for him to confirm or deny the possibility of another impending death. They studied his expression, his posture, the lingering silences that filled the spaces between his words, and Clark, feeling the pressure of their attention, withdrew even further into himself. He stopped attending small gatherings, declined offers to help with chores he normally would have embraced, and shortened his time spent with neighbors. He walked the ridge paths alone, following trails that wound between tall pines and bare oaks. Sometimes he stood at the edge of a bluff for long stretches, staring at the shadowed valley below, as if trying to interpret its secrets. What did he fear? The question drifted through the community like smoke from a slow-burning fire. Some believed Clark feared death itself. Others believed he feared being right, fearing the moment when his prediction would be fulfilled. But a few suspected something deeper, that Clark feared the possibility that he was merely recognizing a pattern that had been waiting beneath his life all along, a pattern that was only now making itself visible. During one of his more withdrawn weeks, Clark visited the graveyard near the old church, the one where his sibling from childhood rested. A man tending to nearby plots noticed him standing at the foot of a grave, not the family grave, but the resting place of Elias. Clark stood there for several long minutes, not moving, not speaking. The man later said he looked like someone trying to understand a sentence written in a language he didn't know. When Clark finally turned to leave, he appeared paler, shaken, as if the quiet earth beneath his boots had whispered something he was not ready to hear. By early spring, the rumor of his dark prediction had spread throughout the valley. Some told it with unease, others with fascination, and occasionally, when the wind rattled through the hollows at night, someone would murmur that Clark could hear things the rest of them could not. Whether they believed it or not, they repeated the story because it felt important, an anchor in a year when too many things had felt unstable, unpredictable, and frightening. But the most unsettling part of the story was not what others believed. It was what Clark himself began to believe. He felt the pressure in the air, a subtle tension that pressed against him in quiet moments. He felt it when waking in the night, breath caught in his chest. He felt it when stepping outside in the morning, sensing a heaviness in the light. And most of all, he felt it in that quiet space inside his mind where the memory of the mournful sound still lingered. The feeling did not tell him who would die, or how, or when. It gave him no details, no visions, no clarity. It was simply a sense of inevitability, a closing door, a tightening circle, a shadow moving closer. And one evening, as he stood beside the fence line watching the sky darken, he whispered something barely audible to himself, words no one else would hear. "I think it's coming for me." Whether he meant death itself or the next sorrow, or whether the line was merely an expression of his deepest fear, no one knows. But that sentence, unheard by any witness, hung like an invisible thread in the cold air, marking the moment when Clark's dread became something closer to acceptance. And it was in that acceptance, fragile and trembling, that the final stretch of his final days quietly began. The quiet acceptance that settled over Clark Hockensmith in those late winter weeks became a turning point so subtle that most people in the region didn't recognize it until much later. Something in him shifted, an inward loosening, a surrender to whatever he sensed pressing in on his life. And in that surrender, his final days truly began, not marked by any dramatic event, but by a slow unraveling of the routines that had once tethered him firmly to the world. It was a change visible only to those who knew him well, and even then, only in the smallest ways. But in the hills where people learned to read silence as carefully as speech, those small shifts carried meaning. Spring came uneasy that year, arriving in fits and starts. Warm days would be followed by unexpected frosts, as though the season itself could not decide whether to settle in or retreat. The earth thawed only in patches. Saplings pushed through the soil hesitantly. Even the birds seemed uncertain, singing less loudly than usual, their calls drifting across the hollows with a tone that felt subdued. It was during this unsettled stretch of early spring that Clark's behavior began to deviate from the rhythms that had shaped him since childhood. He started waking before dawn, often leaving the house without a clear purpose. His mother would find his bed empty, his boots gone. The door cracked ever so slightly, as though he hadn't wanted the sound of it shutting to disturb anyone. Sometimes he returned before breakfast, other times not until mid-morning. When asked where he had gone, he answered only, "Walking." But his clothes told a different story. They carried the scent of damp earth, the cling of pine needles, and the faint mud staining that suggested he had wandered far into the woods. Those who caught sight of him at such hours described him walking with a purposeful slowness, not lost, not aimless, but searching. For what? No one could say. There were also times when he left tools half-finished or chores incomplete, something he had never done before. Clark had always been dependable, meticulous even, finishing tasks with a quiet efficiency admired by many. But now he would pause mid-task, a frown settling on his face, and put the work aside. Once, while repairing a fence, he stopped abruptly, staring at the post he had been hammering as though the tool in his hand no longer belonged to him. Another time, while stacking firewood outside his family's home, he simply walked away, leaving the axe embedded in the block of wood, the fresh pieces scattered at his feet. It was not laziness or carelessness, it was distraction, deep and consuming. He grew withdrawn even among those he trusted most. Conversations became shorter, his responses grew vague. When neighbors greeted him on the road, his answers drifted, as though he were sifting through other thoughts while attempting to anchor himself in the present moment. Some chalked this up to lingering sorrow from the bad year. Others sensed it was something more profound, something pulling him steadily inward. The quiet fear that had shadowed him for years had transformed into a kind of resigned calm, as though he were no longer trying to outrun whatever haunted him. A few specific encounters from these final weeks would later become central to the legend. The first involved an elderly man named Josiah, a woodcarver who lived alone near an old wagon road. Clark had visited him occasionally in years past, bringing food or sharing small talk. But in early spring, Clark arrived unannounced one afternoon. Josiah, surprised to see him, asked what brought him out so far. Clark replied with a single sentence that Josiah would repeat until the end of his life. "I thought I'd come to say goodbye." Josiah assumed Clark was speaking metaphorically, perhaps leaving town for work or visiting distant relatives. But when he asked where Clark was going, Clark only smiled faintly and said, "Not far, but I can feel the road narrowing." Josiah, uneasy, offered him a seat and asked if he was ill. Clark shook his head. No, just listening. The old man could not persuade him to explain further. Clark left shortly after, walking back into the forest with a pace that suggested no hurry, even as a thin grayness settled over the sky. In later retellings, Josiah would admit he felt as though he had just spoken to someone who already had one foot in another world. A similar moment occurred when Clark visited a small burial plot near the church. A woman saw him standing there late one afternoon, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, his gaze fixed not on any single grave, but on the space between them. She approached him gently, asking if he needed anything. Clark looked at her with an expression she would describe as peaceful but far away, and he said, "It's strange how quiet it gets right before something changes." She did not know how to respond. Before she could ask what he meant, he walked away. There were also quieter, more intimate behaviors that his parents noticed. Clark spent more time sitting alone on the back step in the evenings, his shoulders slightly hunched, his eyes tracing the tree line as dusk settled in. Sometimes he hummed softly, tunelessly, a sound his mother did not recognize. Other nights he held a small object in his palm, a pebble, a whittled scrap of wood, a folded piece of paper, turning it slowly in his fingers with a contemplative air. His father found him standing in the yard late one night, barefoot on the cold ground. When asked what he was doing, Clark replied, "Just making sure I can still feel where I stand." His father, unnerved, urged him inside. More than once, Clark mentioned dreams, not detailed ones, not nightmares exactly, but dreams that left him with a lingering sense of finality. He described waking with the impression that he had been walking along a long corridor or narrow path. When asked what lay at the end of it, he said only, "A light that feels familiar." His mother, deeply troubled, pressed him to see a doctor in town, or at least the pastor. Clark declined. "It's nothing that needs fixing," he said. But the conviction in his voice did not ease her fears. Neighbors began noticing his final interactions as well. One woman recalled that Clark stopped by her home unexpectedly to return a small knife he had borrowed months earlier. She had forgotten all about it. When she thanked him, he responded with a simple, "I didn't want to leave anything undone." She laughed gently, thinking he was speaking of chores or errands, but the solemnity in his eyes made her fall silent. Another family remembered him standing at their gate, offering to repair a loose hinge he had noticed weeks before. After finishing the chore, he lingered a moment, staring up at the sky. When the father of the home thanked him, Clark said something that left the man with a chill he carried for years. "I won't be able to help you next time." The man asked why. Clark only shook his head and walked away. In his final days, Clark seemed to exist in a space between presence and absence. He went through the motions of daily life, but his mind, and perhaps something deeper, was already elsewhere. Some who saw him described him as calm, almost serene. Others thought he looked hollow, as though the world had lost its substance. What united all accounts was the unmistakable sense that Clark was preparing for something he believed was inevitable. The sound, the mournful one that had haunted him since childhood, returned with increasing frequency that spring. He never told anyone when he heard it, but those close to him noticed the subtle changes in his posture when it drifted through the trees, the way he stilled, the way his breath caught briefly in his chest, the way his eyes shifted toward the woods as though recognizing an old companion. To Clark, the sound was no longer a warning, it was a signal. And so, in those final weeks, he made choices that suggested a quiet acceptance, returning borrowed items, offering last gestures of kindness, speaking words that hinted at farewell. He did not confess fear, nor did he speak of destiny in any dramatic way, but everything in his actions whispered that Clark Hockensmith believed his life was drawing toward a conclusion he had been sensing for years. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the ridge and painted the fields in fading gold, Clark paused outside his family's home. He looked to the west where shadows stretched long across the land and whispered softly, as if answering a call no one else could hear, "All right, I'm coming." The next morning, he would walk into the trees, and he would not return. He left at first light, stepping out into a world still washed in the pale blue of earliest morning, when even the birds have not quite decided whether to speak. The frost along the grass sparkled faintly, and the air held that damp, metallic smell that rises from the earth when winter gives way to spring. Clark Hockensmith walked with a steady, unhurried gait, as though following a path he had rehearsed many times in his mind. No one saw him go, not his father, still asleep after a night of coughing, nor his mother, who rose only moments after he disappeared over the slope. But the door left slightly ajar, the faint indent in the dirt, and the absence of his boots told her enough. He had gone willingly, purposefully, and something in her heart whispered that he would not return. Clark's final day, as reconstructed from eyewitness reports, newspaper notes, and decades of oral retellings, unfolded in a quiet, eerie mosaic. No single account offers the whole picture, but together they form a haunting portrait of a man moving through the world with a strange clarity, as though everything familiar had taken on a different weight, a different hue, on that last morning. The first confirmed sighting came shortly after sunrise. A farmer tending to his cattle along the ridge noticed Clark walking near the fence line that separated their properties. The farmer called out a greeting. Clark raised a hand in acknowledgement but did not stop. The farmer recalled later that Clark looked calm. Too calm, he said, like a man who had finally settled something heavy inside him. He also remembered something else, something he hesitated to share for years. There was a startling stillness in the air around Clark, a quiet that did not match the early morning chorus rising in the trees. It was like the birds had paused when he passed, the man said, not frightened, just listening. Clark descended into the hollow shortly after. Another neighbor, an older woman who lived alone near a small spring, saw him passing along the creek bed. She asked where he was headed. "Just walking," he replied, his tone gentle, distant. She noticed that he carried nothing with him, no food, no canteen, no coat despite the lingering chill. "You'll catch your death out here," she warned. Clark gave a small, melancholy smile. "Maybe," he said, and he continued on. These accounts formed the last confirmed interactions Clark had with anyone that day. After that, he moved deeper into the woods, following a trail no one else used regularly, a trail that twisted between ancient oaks and climbed toward a rocky outcropping where the hills fell away in jagged shadows. The ground was still soft in places, marked by his footprints later used to trace his passage. They showed no signs of hesitation. His stride was even, unwavering. He was a man walking towards something he expected to find. Around late morning, a hunter traveling through the area reported hearing what he described as a single cry, short, sharp, like someone startled. He could not place the direction, and the woods were thick with echoes, but the sound stayed with him for the rest of his life. When news of Clark's disappearance spread, the hunter came forward, convinced that the cry belonged to him. Others argued it might have been an animal, but the timing, just before noon, aligned with the next clue uncovered in the search that followed. It was a small clearing deep within the woods, a place where the light filtered through the canopy in thin streaks. There, searchers later found evidence that Clark had stopped. A small patch of compressed grass where he had likely sat or knelt, a spot where the leaves were disturbed by a handprint, and, most unsettling of all, two small stones laid neatly beside each other, the kind of arrangement Clark had been known to make as a child when trying to calm himself. No one knew whether the stones held any meaning that morning, but they were the only sign of hesitation in his final hours. By afternoon, Clark had reached the ridge above the river. The path there was treacherous, narrow, and often slick from runoff, yet his footprints showed no sign of struggle. He walked with intention. The river below was swollen, its waters loud against the rocks, masking smaller sounds. Several people later insisted they heard nothing unusual that day, no shouts, no splashes, no calls for help. But the river drowned many things. Clark's disappearance was not noticed immediately. His mother assumed he had gone to visit a neighbor or help with a task somewhere along the ridge. His father believed he had taken one of his long, solitary walks. Evening came with a pale sunset that bled slowly into the tree line, and still Clark had not returned. His mother lit a lantern on the porch, a signal he would never ignore, and waited. But the light flickered in the rising wind, untouched by the footsteps she longed to hear. By nightfall, the alarm spread. Neighbors gathered. Lanterns swung through the hollows. Men called his name into the darkening forest. Dogs were sent to track him, though the river's damp air muddled the scent. The wind carried voices away before they reached the far trees. The search lasted deep into the night, then resumed at dawn. What they found the next afternoon formed the foundation of the mystery that would outlive everyone who searched for him. Downstream, caught against a cluster of rocks along a bend in the river, lay Clark's coat. Dry, strangely clean, and folded with deliberate care. Not discarded, not torn. Folded the way one might set aside a garment before work. A mile farther downstream, searchers found a single boot. The river had swept it into a tangle of roots along the bank. But no second boot surfaced, no shirt, no sign of a body. The river was searched for weeks. It was not deep in most places, but its currents ran deceptively fast. When a body sank, it often rose days later. But Clark's never did. Several possibilities were proposed. Some believed he slipped on the ridge and fell into the water, struck unconscious before he could cry out. Others believed he intentionally entered the river, seeking silence after a year of unbearable weight. A few argued he ran away, though this theory faltered under the weight of his abandoned belongings and the absence of any sighting beyond that day. And then there were those, quiet, superstitious, born of older beliefs, who whispered that something had taken him, not a person, not an accident, but the thing Clark had sensed for years, the shadow, the omen, the sound drifting through the trees. The newspapers of the time printed brief, factual notices. Young man missing, coat found, search ongoing. A week later, feared drowned, body not recovered. Then silence. But the community did not fall silent. They dissected the search. They recounted every remark Clark had made that year. They replayed his strange statements, his distant looks, his quiet preparations. They pieced together his final walk until it resembled both a path and a prophecy. Years later, long after his parents passed, long after those who searched for him grew old and died, stories continued to circulate about the young man who walked into the trees and never returned. Some said they saw him near the ridge on fog-heavy mornings. Others claimed the mournful sound still drifted through the woods where he disappeared. But the fact remained. Clark Hockensmith walked into the world on his final day with a calm that no one could explain. And the land, wide, patient, unforgiving, kept its silence. In the days that followed Clark Hockensmith's disappearance, the ridge felt heavier than usual, as though the land itself had absorbed the quiet shock of losing one of its own. People spoke in low tones, keeping their voices close to their chests, as if raising them might disturb something fragile or provoke whatever force they believed had brushed against Clark's final steps. Even those who had dismissed the rumors about him felt a chill when they heard the news. A missing person was not rare in the Ozarks of that era. Rivers swallowed riders, storms swept travelers off trails, and wilderness held its share of secrets. But something about Clark's absence struck deeper, cutting into the community with an edge that lingered long after the initial search was called off. Once the first frantic days passed and prospects of finding him alive faded, the conversation shifted. People began to ask not only where Clark had gone, but what his disappearance meant. They questioned the strange calm he carried in his final days, the odd calmness in his voice, the way he had moved through the region as though he were visiting it for the last time. And as they asked, a current of speculation rose, subtle, hesitant, but persistent. The Ozarks was no stranger to folklore, and in the void left by Clark's absence, stories began to form like mist gathering in low places. The earliest rumors were simple and rooted in grief, that Clark had sensed something was wrong in the valley, that he felt a heaviness he could not explain. Families who had spoken to him in his final weeks recounted their conversations with a trembling uncertainty. He seemed finished somehow, one said, like a man who had reached the end of something. Another described the way he looked toward the hills while speaking, as though someone stood in the trees behind her. These impressions, faint though they were, acted as tinder for the flames of rumor. The story that spread next was far more vivid, a claim that Clark had been followed in the weeks before he vanished, not by a person, but by an unseen presence. The first mention of it came from a young boy who told his parents he had seen Clark standing on the ridge at dusk, staring behind him with an expression of fear. The boy insisted that Clark raised his hand as though warding off something in the shadows. Adults dismissed the child's account at first, but when repeated alongside other fragments, whispers that Clark had muttered about a shadow, that he had been uneasy in the woods, that animals had reacted strangely around him, the story took shape. It became easy to imagine him walking into the forest, not alone, but watched. As spring deepened and the weeks passed without the river giving up his body, the rumors evolved again. Some insisted Clark had walked into the woods willingly because he believed he had been marked by fate, by misfortune, by the lingering scent of the bad year. Others believed he had known the exact moment he would die and had stepped into the wilderness to meet it. These ideas grew not from malice, but from the human need to explain what felt unexplainable. People remembered his prediction. They remembered his final words to neighbors, his quiet goodbyes, the return of small borrowed items. They remembered the strange calmness he wore like a mantle. To them, these signs pointed not to despair, but to inevitability. Then came the darker rumor, the one that stirred unease even among practical men. It circulated quietly at first, whispered on porches and beside wood stoves. According to this version, Clark had not merely predicted another death, he had predicted his own. The claim was that he had told someone, in confidence, that he would not survive the year, but the identity of the confidant changed with each retelling, and the words he supposedly used shifted like water slipping through cupped hands. One version said he spoke of a last walk. Another claimed he said, "I can hear it coming." The most dramatic insisted he told a friend, "The trees have started calling me." None of these accounts have documented sources, yet when woven together, they gave the impression of a man who walked willingly toward his fate, guided not by despair, but by a sense of recognition. Not all rumors leaned into the supernatural. Some people clung to more grounded explanations. Clark might have slipped, struck his head, been swept under by the river, or he might have become disoriented in the woods and fallen into a ravine. These theories were repeated often, especially by men who feared the vulnerability of believing the darker stories. But even among them, doubt crept in. Why was his coat folded? Why were only scattered belongings found? Why had his tracks shown no sign of panic? Why, if he fell, was there no sign of struggle? These questions gnawed at the edges of reason, and reason in the Ozarks has always lived side by side with legend. The possibility that Clark had run away also surfaced, though it found little soil in which to grow. Anyone who knew him understood that he had nowhere to go, no secret desire for escape, no hidden restlessness. And if he had left by choice, he would not have gone without leaving some sign for his mother. Those who cared for him insisted he was too kind, too anchored by duty, to leave his family with that kind of pain. The runaway theory faded quickly, but one rumor, quiet, unsettling, persisted despite attempts to dismiss it. It whispered that Clark had been lured into the woods by something only he could hear. Several people mentioned the mournful sound he had spoken of in passing, though none had ever heard it themselves. They claimed the sound had followed him through childhood, resurfacing whenever misfortune struck, and that he had grown sensitive to its presence during the bad year. They argued that he had walked toward that sound not out of fear, but out of resignation. If the land itself had called him, they reasoned, he would have answered. This rumor, more a feeling than a story, carried an eerie weight in the region. The Ozarks is a place where the natural world is often believed to possess its own consciousness, its own rhythms and warnings. People spoke of hollows where echoes linger too long, of caves where footsteps continue after the walker has paused, of ridges where the wind shifts direction without cause. In such a landscape, Clark's final walk seemed less like madness and more like submission to an old, inscrutable rhythm. In the months after his disappearance, these tales were shared and reshared until they formed a tapestry of memory embroidered with fear, pity, and fascination. Some spoke of Clark with reverence, as though he had been touched by something sacred. Others spoke of him with caution, as though his fate carried a lesson about heeding signs. A few spoke of him with dread, believing his story was a warning that misfortune could settle upon anyone, no matter how kind or careful. And then, as often happens in places where hard lives must go on, the rumors began to blur into legend. People stopped speaking of what was known and began speaking of what was felt. Clark became a figure who existed partly in the world and partly in the imagination of those who survived him. His life, and his strange, sorrowful final days, became a story told at twilight, when the hills turn purple and the air grows still. Children heard his tale as a cautionary whisper. Adults told it as a meditation on fate, and elders carried it as a memory woven into the land itself. But even as the legend grew, one detail remained unresolved: the silence of the woods where Clark vanished. No matter how often people walked that trail, no matter how many times they searched for signs, the place offered nothing. No answers, no revelations, only the stillness of trees that had witnessed everything yet told nothing. And so the ridge remained haunted, not by spirits but by absence, by the void left by a young man who walked into the trees on a silent morning and never returned, by the sense that something had taken shape in those woods that spring, something unseen but deeply felt, and by the whispers that continued in the darkened corners of Ozark homes, where people wondered what had truly called Clark Hockensmith into the shadows, and whether that same presence still lingers along the ridge, waiting, listening, returning each time the wind carries a mournful sound through the trees. The months following Clark Hockensmith's disappearance settled into the fabric of Ozark memory with an eerie stillness. But it was in the years that followed that his story changed shape entirely. What began as whispered confusion soon ripened into something far larger, something that reached beyond simple tragedy. When a person vanishes without explanation, the vacuum left behind inevitably fills with imagination. And in the Ozarks, where stories cling to the land as stubbornly as cedar roots, Clark's absence became fertile ground for legend. By the time 2 or 3 years had passed, very few people still spoke of Clark as simply a missing man. Instead, he had become a figure surrounded by a haze of superstition, sorrow, and unease. Rumors drifted from hollow to hollow with the persistence of drifting fog. And while some stories faded as seasons changed, others grew stronger, carried by the voices of those who claimed to have heard something, or seen something, or simply felt something unusual when they walked the path where Clark was last known to tread. The first wave of stories that solidified in local memory focused on omens, strange signs people claimed occurred before or after Clark's disappearance. A woman living near the river insisted that in the week leading up to his final day, she heard a dog howl every night at the same hour, facing the woods where Clark often walked. She said the animal seemed terrified, its fur raised, its body rigid, as though seeing something no one else could. Another neighbor recalled that the night before Clark vanished, her chickens refused to roost, pacing restlessly until dawn. These recollections may have been honest memories, but more likely were reinterpreted through the lens of what came later. Still, repetition gave them weight. People retold them with a quiet conviction, as if each detail patched another seam in the legend forming around Clark. Then there were the stories that stretched beyond natural explanation. One man, an elderly farmer known for his stubborn sincerity, claimed that a week after Clark disappeared, he heard footsteps outside his cabin late at night. Slow, steady, deliberate. He armed himself and opened the door, expecting to confront a trespasser. But no one stood there. He followed the sound around the side of the house, heart pounding, only to find that the footsteps continued ahead of him, invisible, yet unmistakably real. He insisted the sound moved toward the woods, then faded entirely. When he learned the next morning that search efforts had ceased, he believed the footsteps belonged to Clark's spirit, returning for a final walk. Another tale came from a young woman who lived alone with her mother near the ridge. She claimed that one evening, months after Clark vanished, she saw a man standing near the tree line at dusk. His outline was faint in the dimming light, but she recognized the shape immediately. She called out his name, stunned and relieved, but the figure did not move. Instead, he seemed to dissolve into the gathering shadows, leaving behind only the faintest impression that someone had indeed been there. She refused to speak of the incident again in later years, embarrassed by the attention it brought her. Yet others told the story on her behalf, each time adding small embellishments that strengthened the legend. With time, the stories shifted from isolated experiences to broader claims that Clark's presence lingered in the hills. People said that on certain nights when the wind threaded through the pines just right, one could hear a soft, mournful sound, like a distant voice calling through the trees. Some insisted the sound resembled the one Clark had described in his youth, the sound that had followed him throughout his life. Whether they truly heard anything or merely convinced themselves they did, the belief took hold with surprising strength. It brought a shiver to evening conversations, a hush to gatherings whenever someone mentioned walking alone at dusk. As the stories grew, they began to change form, becoming less about Clark the man and more about Clark the symbol. No longer was he viewed as a quiet, troubled young man who vanished. He became something else, a reminder of the thin veil between the ordinary and the inexplicable. Older residents began warning children not to wander too deep into the woods, telling them that Clark's spirit watched from the shadows, guiding the lost or perhaps leading them astray depending on their intentions. Others claimed he appeared to those facing hardship, not to scare them, but as a sign that sorrow walked near. Eventually, the legend took a darker turn. In some tellings, Clark became a harbinger of misfortune, a figure glimpsed in the moments before tragedy. One story claimed that a man saw Clark standing at the end of his barn the night before his livestock fell ill. Another insisted a woman spotted Clark on the ridge just before her husband suffered a fatal accident. These stories rarely held factual ground, and their details shifted wildly from teller to teller. Yet their persistence said more about the fears of the community than about Clark's true nature. In times of uncertainty, people often look for patterns, and Clark's story offered a framework for understanding the shadows life casts without explanation. Beneath the darker legends, however, a softer counter-story quietly persisted, passed down by those who knew Clark best. These accounts refused to paint him as a ghost or omen. Instead, they emphasized his kindness, his gentle nature, his quiet sensitivity. To these voices, Clark's fate represented not a haunting, but a sorrow, an unfinished story, a life overtaken by burdens he could not express. These individuals spoke of him with tenderness, defending his memory against the distortions that folklore thrives on. They insisted he had never meant harm, that he had never embraced the dark image some cast upon him. They believed he had simply been overwhelmed by the weight of a life he could not fully understand. But even the tender stories could not undo the pull of the more sensational ones. The human mind clings naturally to mystery, and Clark's disappearance offered mystery in abundance. A young man troubled by unspoken fears, vanishing into the woods without a trace. It held all the ingredients of folklore: uncertainty, sorrow, a sense of inevitability, and the haunting possibility that something unseen had guided his final steps. As decades passed, the stories became increasingly elaborate. Some claimed Clark's ghost walked the ridge on fog-laden mornings, leaving footprints in the dew that disappeared by noon. Others insisted they heard whispering near the river, soft phrases that sounded like a man's voice speaking names or warnings. A few swore the woods grew unnaturally quiet at the site where Clark's coat was found, as if nature itself acknowledged the lingering weight of his absence. These stories found receptive audiences around campfires, at late-night church gatherings, and during stormy evenings when wind rattled loose shutters and the hills groaned under the pressure of changing seasons. Newspaper archives from the period following his disappearance show little mention of Clark's evolving legend. The printed record remains factual, restrained, almost oblivious to the cultural ghost forming in the community's imagination. But the oral record, the stories passed from generation to generation, reveals something different, a gradual transformation of Clark Hockensmith from a real man into a figure woven into the mythology of the Ozarks. Not all legends grow from grand tales. Some take root in quiet tragedies, fed by fear, memory, and the fragile line between coincidence and omen. Clark's story became one of those rare legends that began small, just a whisper, and grew into something felt rather than spoken. It became a presence in the region, a reminder that some people carry burdens heavier than the world around them can understand. And though the stories varied, one element remained constant across all versions: the sense that Clark had been touched by death long before his own came. Whether that touch marked him, guided him, or simply haunted him is something no one ever fully agreed upon. But the legend persisted, rising and falling like the hills themselves, shaping the region's understanding of fate, intuition, and the uneasy space between truth and folklore. It is in this legacy, half truth, half shadow, that Clark Hockensmith's story continued to grow long after his footsteps vanished into the trees. In time, the legend of Clark Hockensmith grew so large that it seemed to eclipse the man himself. Storytellers embroidered his memory with the bright threads of imagination, fear, and awe, until the line between truth and tradition blurred. Yet even as new tales took root, there remained a quieter effort beneath the surface. Those who sought to separate the factual from the fantastical, to understand Clark not as an omen or shadow, but as a young man whose life had been marked by an unusual confluence of sorrow and speculation. These were the researchers, genealogists, local historians, and wandering, curious souls who came decades later, intent on tracing the path of his life through the remnants he left behind. And it is through their patient work that a second narrative began to form, one grounded not in rumor but in evidence, though even evidence in the Ozarks often speaks with two voices. The earliest attempts to uncover the truth behind Clark's disappearance occurred only a few years after he vanished. The local pastor, troubled by how quickly gossip had overtaken memory, began recording what he considered the reliable testimonies of those who had known Clark. His notes, handwritten in a wavering script, remain preserved in a box of old church papers. They reveal a young man remembered with tenderness, diligent, thoughtful, and burdened by an inexplicable heaviness that no one understood at the time. In these early documents, Clark is not depicted as a harbinger of misfortune, but as a sensitive boy who carried sorrow the way some children carry shyness. These were the first attempts to restore him to the realm of human, rather than mythic tragedy. But as years passed, the pastor's notes gathered dust, overshadowed by the spread of oral stories. It was not until the mid-20th century that renewed efforts emerged. A local genealogist, researching the broader Hockensmith lineage, stumbled upon Clark's name and became captivated by the conflicting accounts surrounding him. She combed through courthouse archives, reading brittle newspapers and scanning handwritten ledgers. She discovered traces of Clark in land records, census rolls, and church registries, each entry faint but real, proof that he had indeed lived, worked, and moved through these hills in ways more ordinary than extraordinary. Her research revealed something surprising. Clark's family had already experienced multiple tragedies long before the rumors claimed he carried misfortune. A sibling who died in infancy, an uncle lost to a hunting accident, a cousin drowned in a swollen creek. These events, common in the era, suggested that Clark had grown up surrounded by grief. not because he caused it, but because the Ozarks itself was a place where loss walked hand in hand with life. To her, this explained far more about Clark's temperament than any supernatural speculation. Yet even she admitted that the rumors surrounding his final year remained oddly persistent, even when contradicted by fact. Another researcher, a folklorist from a nearby college, became fascinated by the psychological dimensions of Clark's story. In a paper she presented at a regional conference, she argued that Clark's life reflected a classic pattern. A quiet individual in a superstitious community becomes the vessel for collective anxieties during a period of hardship. The bad year, she suggested, acted as the tinder. Clark's introspective personality provided the spark, and together they created a story that seemed to explain the inexplicable in a time when people desperately needed meaning. Her work was thoughtful, measured, and sympathetic, but even she acknowledged that some elements of the story resisted rational explanation, particularly the details surrounding Clark's final days and the calm, almost ritualistic way he moved through them. Then there were the contradictory documents, an inevitable feature of historical research in rural areas. One newspaper reported that Clark had been seen near the river hours before his disappearance. Another claimed he was last seen near the Ridge Trail a full mile away. A single misprint in the county ledger listed his age incorrectly, sparking a brief rumor that there were two men named Clark Hockensmith roaming the region. Another document misspelled his surname, leading later genealogists down unnecessary tangents. These errors, when layered atop one another, created a fog through which the truth became hard to discern. Complicating matters further were the oral stories collected from elders in the mid-1900s. Some swore that Clark had spoken of hearing strange sounds long before his disappearance. Others insisted those details were added by later generations. One elderly neighbor recalled that Clark once helped her mend a broken gate and seemed perfectly cheerful. Another claimed he saw Clark standing alone one evening, staring at the horizon with an expression of deep dread. These accounts, though offered earnestly, contradicted one another at every turn. And as is often the case with memory, each recollection revealed more about the teller than about the man himself. The truth versus legend divide grew even wider as modern researchers tried to map Clark's final movements. Using topographical maps and reconstructed trails, one historian traced the route searchers believed Clark had taken on his last day. The historian concluded that the river's current and the natural bends in the terrain would have made it extremely unlikely for Clark's coat to have ended up where it was found unless he had placed it there deliberately. Another researcher countered that seasonal flooding could have carried the coat from a higher point. Yet another argued that the coat's condition, unusually clean and folded, suggested an act of intention, not accident. None of these arguments fully convinced the others, and the biggest question of all remained unanswered. Why had no body ever surfaced? In most drowning cases, even in cold rivers, the body eventually rises. But Clark's never did. Some pointed out that the river contained deep pockets, submerged snags, and narrow caverns capable of trapping a body indefinitely. Others argued that if he had drowned, some trace, clothing, bone, fragment, even a boot, would have appeared eventually. Only one boot was ever found, nothing more. This absence became the beating heart of the legend, and more than one serious researcher admitted privately that Clark's disappearance felt different from the typical tragedies of the era. "There's a wrongness to it," one wrote in a letter. "Something about his final days feels scripted, almost ceremonial, as if he believed he was answering a call we cannot hear." But the truth versus legend dialogue did not end with researchers. Locals who live near the ridge have their own interpretations. Some insist Clark intended to take his own life, overwhelmed by the weight of the bad year. They point to his quiet goodbyes, his return of borrowed items, his eerie calm. Others argue he had no intention of dying, but experienced a sudden fainting spell or accident. They believe he slipped on wet ground, possibly hitting his head and falling into the river. But a smaller group, firmly rooted in the old Ozark worldview, rejects both explanations. To them, Clark was not by madness or despair, but by something older. That belief, though impossible to prove, persists because the land itself seems to hold the story with a kind of reverence. Wander the woods where Clark walked, and you may understand why. The silence feels different there, more absorbing, more deliberate. The trees grow in strange angles, their shadows twisting over one another. The wind funnels through the hollow with a peculiar moan, almost like breath passing through a narrow passage. It is easy to understand why legend thrives here. And it is here, at the intersection of documented fact and whispered folklore, that Clark Hockensmith's story continues to live, half illuminated, half hidden, like the thin light that filters through the dense Ozark canopy. To understand why Clark Hockensmith's story grew such long, persistent roots in the Ozark imagination, one must step back from the details of his disappearance and look instead at the land that shaped both the man and the legend. The old Ozarks were a place where death wore many faces, not always frightening, not always sudden, but always present, threaded through daily life with a quiet intimacy that modern readers may find difficult to fathom. In Clark's time, families buried their dead within sight of their homes. People sat with the dying, washed their bodies, dug the graves themselves, and carried grief not as an event, but as a companion. Death was not a stranger. It was a familiar traveler passing through town on a well-worn road. And within this cultural landscape, it is not surprising that Clark's sensitivity, his unease, his quiet premonitions resonated deeply with those who shared the hills with him. Growing up in such a place meant understanding from childhood that life was fragile. Illness came silently. Storms killed livestock without warning. Accidents stole sons and fathers in moments. Children learned to read the sky, listen to the wind's tone, and study the behavior of animals for signs of change. Every family kept stories of narrow escapes, eerie coincidences, and omens their elders had sworn upon. These stories were not frivolous entertainment, they were survival. They helped people make sense of misfortune, offering patterns where chaos threatened to overwhelm. In this environment, someone like Clark, quiet, perceptive, attuned to subtle shifts, would not only stand out but become a natural vessel for collective meaning. Communities in the Ozarks interpreted signs with a seriousness born of necessity. A dog howling repeatedly at night meant someone was nearing death. A falling picture inside a home foretold a coming sorrow. A bird tapping at a window meant spirits were nearby. Even the sudden silence of cicadas could signal a change in the air. These beliefs were passed down not as superstition, but as inherited knowledge, reminders that the world was both physical and spiritual, both visible and unseen. When Clark muttered that the room was too quiet before Elias died, people remembered. When he spoke of a heaviness in the air, they listened, not because he was strange, but because in their worldview, such comments were not unusual. They were warnings. But when the pattern repeated, when death seemed to gather around him, when he grew increasingly troubled, when his final days were marked by a sense of foreknowledge, the beliefs that usually comforted the community began to turn inward, tightening around Clark like a noose he never intended to wear. To them, he became more than a grieving young man. He became a figure who lived close to the unseen. That closeness mattered because old Ozark culture held a complicated relationship with those believed to possess second sight. Such individuals were both respected and feared. They were said to perceive things others could not: the approach of storms, the moment death entered a home, the presence of spirits lingering near the living. But this gift, or curse, came at a cost. Those who saw too much were often thought to be burdened by it. And burden was something Clark carried visibly in his silence, his solemn gaze, his restless nights, his anxious walks along the ridge. People read these signs within the only framework they knew, And so Clark, whether he wanted it or not, became a kind of interpreter between the living and the unknown. It's important to emphasize that the Ozarks did not sentimentalize death. They respected it. They feared it. They prepared for it with a blend of practical care and spiritual vigilance. The living built coffins in advance, stored shrouds, and memorized funeral hymns long before they were needed. Death was not an interruption to life. It was woven into its fabric. A young man haunted by foreboding, then, was not dismissed or ridiculed. He was watched, studied, interpreted. And when Clark vanished, the community already possessed the interpretive tools to make sense of it, whether those interpretations were accurate or not. Another layer in this cultural tapestry was the belief in the calling, a phenomenon elders once described with a mixture of dread and reverence. The calling was said to be a subtle summons, an awareness that one's time on earth was nearing its end. Some felt it as a deep tiredness. Others said they heard whispers or dreamed of long roads. A few spoke of seeing a deceased loved one near their doorway. These experiences were not considered madness. They were part of the old spiritual rhythm of the hills. And when people remembered Clark's last days, his goodbyes, his calmness, his quiet preparations, they saw the hallmarks of someone who felt the calling. They did not imagine he had been taken. They believed he had been summoned. It is this belief, perhaps more than any other, that transformed Clark from a troubled young man into a figure of myth. In the Ozark worldview, a person called by fate must answer, whether they wish to or not. Clark's disappearance fit the motif too perfectly. A man burdened by uneasy intuition, walking willingly into the trees at dawn, leaving behind quiet clues of intention, but no trace of struggle. In this framework, his fate was not tragic. It was inevitable. Of course, not everyone accepted the calling explanation. Some placed Clark's story within a broader pattern common to isolated communities, the tendency to elevate unusual individuals into symbols. They argued that Clark became a mirror for the region's collective anxieties, the bad year, the storms, the sicknesses. He became a way to give shape to fear. Others believed he was overwhelmed by melancholy, a quiet despair mistaken for spiritual premonition. But even among these more rational thinkers, there remained an undercurrent of uncertainty. They, too, felt something strange in the woods where Clark walked. They, too, sensed the peculiar silence. Even the skeptics admitted that Clark's final days contained an uncanny symmetry, the kind that defies tidy explanations. Generations later, when historians attempted to understand why Clark's story survived when so many others faded, they found the answer rooted not in the sensational details, but in the cultural soil of the region. Clark's legend thrived because it touched upon themes that had existed in Ozark life for centuries: death as companion, signs as warnings, the veil between worlds as thin as morning mist. Clark embodied all of these themes without intending to. His life was not extraordinary. His sorrow was not unique. But the way his final days unfolded, with quiet resignation, with an eerie sense of expectation, fits so neatly into the ancestral stories that people could not help but see him as part of a much older pattern. In the end, Clark became both a product of his time and a reflection of its deepest beliefs. His story grew because the land itself, quiet, watchful, steeped in old traditions, seemed to absorb him. And in doing so, the Ozarks claimed him not only as a memory, but as a symbol. A young man who walked at the trembling edge between the known and the unknowable. And perhaps that is why, even today, when the wind presses low against the ridges and the trees lean ever so slightly toward one another, some still say they feel the echo of Clark Hockensmith passing by, a reminder of how thin the boundary can be between a life lived and a legend born. As the decades drifted onward long after Clark Hockensmith's disappearance slipped from active search into quiet lore, the places touched by his story took on lives of their own. In the Ozarks, land is more than terrain. It remembers, it absorbs, it echoes. A hollow that once held tragedy will carry its weight for generations, no matter how the vegetation changes or the weather scours its stones. And so it was with those parts of the ridge where Clark spent his final hours. The places he passed through, fence lines, creek beds, old footpaths swallowed by leaf litter, the bend in the river where his coat was found, became woven into his legend until it was impossible to separate the man from the land. People began visiting those places without fully admitting why. They might say they were out for a walk or checking their traps, but their eyes lingered longer than usual, scanning the trees for something they could not articulate. The trail itself seemed no different from 100 others that snaked through the hills, yet those who walked it claimed the forest felt unusually watchful. A hunter who passed through the clearing where Clark had once knelt to arrange 2 small stones said the air there always felt a shade colder, even in summer. A woman who gathered herbs near the ridge swore that her dog refused to cross a certain point in the path, growling low whenever she urged him forward. These experiences were subtle, easily dismissed, yet they added to the quiet reputation the place was growing. The woods held Clark's memory as though he had left a portion of himself there. The story shifted again during the 1940s when an old homestead near the river, abandoned for years, was razed to make way for timber work. A group of men hired to clear the land reported hearing footsteps around the property during their first night on the job. Steady, slow, unmistakably human. The men assumed it was one of their own, though all were present inside the cabin. When they investigated, lanterns lifted high, the footsteps stopped abruptly just beyond the tree line. No animal or intruder emerged from the darkness. The incident unnerved the crew, and they took to working only in daylight. While none claimed the presence was Clark directly, the story quietly joined the growing archive of experiences tied to the area. Another tale emerged from a man fishing along the riverbank in the 1960s. He described hearing a soft melody, humming perhaps, carried faintly across the water. At first he thought it came from someone upstream, but as he listened, he realized the sound had no clear source. It drifted in a pattern, rising and fading in a way that felt unnatural. Like someone trying to remember a tune, he said later. The melody reminded him of the old Ozark lullabies his grandmother used to sing, tunes with no official lyrics but deep, haunting rhythms tied to immigrant ballads and frontier laments. As he packed to leave, he felt watched, not with hostility, but with curiosity. It unsettled him enough that he never returned to that part of the river again. By then, the stories had begun to split into 2 main threads. In one version, Clark became a gentle presence, a lost soul wandering familiar paths, neither threatening nor at peace. Sightings described him as a quiet figure standing beside a tree or near the riverbank, fading when approached. People spoke of feeling sadness rather than fear, as if Clark were trying to walk home but could not quite find the way. In the other version, Clark became something more ominous. These tellings were whispered cautiously, often by those who believed strongly in the old mountain ways. In this view, Clark did not simply linger, he warned. Several households claimed that seeing him or sensing his presence preceded a misfortune. Whether this was coincidence or the power of suggestion is impossible to know, but the belief took root. A woman who lost her brother in an accident said she had dreamt of Clark standing outside her window the night before. A farmer whose barn burned unexpectedly claimed he had seen a figure in the distance that morning, walking the tree line with an eerie stillness. These accounts varied wildly, yet each folded neatly into the darker branch of Clark's legend, the belief that he had become a symbol of impending sorrow. It is worth remembering that these were not malicious stories. In the Ozarks, omens are not feared so much as respected, acknowledged as part of the rhythm between life and mystery. People did not think Clark caused tragedies, only that he reflected them, the way a still pool reflects the sky. That reflection, however, gave him a haunting presence in memory, making his legend one that lingered not only in the imagination, but in the very atmosphere of the places tied to his story. One of the most persistent tales concerns the old logging road near the ridge. For decades, travelers reported hearing footsteps keeping pace with their own as they walked that route. Sometimes the footsteps followed for yards before fading. Other times, they seemed to come from ahead, as though someone waited just out of sight. A few individuals described hearing breathing nearby, a slow, soft inhale and exhale that made the hairs on their arms rise. Yet when they turned, no one stood behind them. These experiences became so tied to Clark's legend that locals began referring to that stretch of the ridge as Hockensmith's Walk, a name that endures in some families to this day. There were also claims of a lantern glow seen through the trees on moonless nights. Families living nearby insisted that the light moved with deliberate purpose, threading through the woods as though carried by someone searching. Several believed it was Clark retracing his final steps, forever caught in that last morning's walk. Skeptics dismissed the lights as reflections from distant homesteads or tricks of moonlight, but those who had seen the glow held a different conviction. The lantern's steady bobbing felt too controlled, too intentional to be an illusion. In the 1970s, a local teacher collected a series of oral histories from elderly residents for a cultural preservation project. Among the dozens of interviews, Clark's name surfaced repeatedly, not as a ghost story told to frighten children, but as a quiet, sorrowful presence woven into the region's identity. One woman described hearing her grandmother speak of Clark as a figure who walked between breaths, appearing only in the uneasy stillness that comes before storms. Another recounted that her father always tipped his hat when passing the part of the river where Clark's coat was found, out of respect for the boy who listened too closely to the world. These accounts, though varied, shared a common thread. Clark's memory was treated with solemnity, not dread. And perhaps most haunting of all were the stories of those who claimed that Clark appeared only to people who were themselves nearing a great change, be it a hardship, a revelation, or even death. These stories presented Clark not as a warning, but as a companion, guiding individuals on the threshold of something difficult. A man who battled illness for years said he once dreamed of Clark standing at the foot of his bed, offering no words, only presence. A widow described feeling a sudden calm one night, followed by a sensation that someone stood beside her porch. When she looked, she saw nothing, but she felt unmistakably that she was not alone. Such tales blurred the boundaries between myth and comfort in the old Ozark way. They offered meaning in their ambiguity, solace in their uncertainty. They depicted Clark as neither ghost nor omen, but a memory that had become sensitive to human frailty, just as he had been sensitive to sorrow in life. Places shaped these stories as much as people did. The woods where Clark vanished, the river that refused to give him back, the ridge that carried the echo of his final walk, all became part of a landscape colored by quiet tragedy. And those places, in turn, shaped the people who lived near them, reinforcing a sense that Clark's presence lingered not as a specter, but as a reminder of the thin edges we all walk between the seen and unseen. In the end, the locations tied to his legend served as both map and memory, a way of keeping his story grounded even as it drifted into the realm of folklore. And as we step away from those woods, from the river's cold bend, from the silent ridges where footsteps sometimes echo without source, we carry with us the enduring truth that some stories are shaped not by the events themselves, but by the places that hold them. In the quiet corners of the Ozarks where stories outlast the people who first breathed them into being, the name Clark Hockensmith remains a soft echo, never shouted, never forgotten. His story drifts between campsites and front porches, carried by elders whose mouths shape the words with a kind of reverence, as though retelling his fate might stir the air in ways they do not entirely trust. And in this final stretch of his tale, what remains is not clarity, not closure, but a lingering question about the nature of certain lives, lives that seem touched by something we can sense but never fully understand. When people speak of Clark now, they do so in tones reserved for those whose stories resist explanation. They talk about his quietness, his sensitivity, the heaviness he carried even as a boy. They talk about the mournful sound he claimed to hear, and how that sound seemed to weave itself through the timelines of his life like a thread pulled taut. They talk about the bad year that shook the valley, the deaths he seemed to sense before they arrived, the strange premonition he voiced before disappearing into the woods. But more than any specific detail, they talk about the way Clark's absence feels like a presence, something thin, persistent, whispering just beyond reach. With time, the legend softened. The darker rumors, those that painted him as an omen, dimmed as the generations most prone to fear the invisible passed on. What replaced them was something gentler, more reflective. People began to see Clark not as a harbinger, but as a reminder, a figure who walked the ridge between the burdens of the living and the mysteries of the unknown. In many retellings, he appears not as a ghost, but as a symbol of how certain people seem to carry sorrow in ways that make them unusually permeable, open to the shadows that others sense only faintly. It is not that Clark brought misfortune. It is that he recognized it early, felt its tremors with a sensitivity that unsettled those around him. Some say Clark was a man born thin-skinned to the world, a phrase used in old Ozark lore to describe those who are too receptive to the energies around them, weather, emotion, memory, death. These people were not cursed, nor necessarily blessed. They simply lived closer to the edge of things, where the line between intuition and superstition grows faint. Clark's life, viewed through this cultural lens, becomes almost inevitable. The weight he carried was not malevolence, nor madness, but a too keen perception that bent him toward a fate others walked past without noticing. When modern storytellers recount Clark's life, they often return to the question, was he running from something or towards something? And the truth, as far as truth can be extracted from a story this old, is that Clark may have done neither. He may simply have been answering a call, one that frightened him, shaped him, and finally beckoned him into the trees. Whether that call came from grief, intuition, destiny, or imagination is something each listener must decide for themselves. Those who lean toward psychological explanations argue that Clark's final days resemble fate, not because he was chosen by it, but because he believed he was. The mind, when burdened by prolonged grief and isolation, can shape powerful convictions. And in the Ozarks, where silence and solitude are abundant, such convictions can deepen like roots in wet soil. This view does not diminish Clark. If anything, it casts him in a more human light, a young man overwhelmed by sorrow, by coincidence, by the emotional aftermath of a relentless year. His steps into the woods become the steps of someone who had simply reached the limit of what his heart could bear. Others take a spiritual view. To them, Clark's life reflects the rhythms of a world where unseen forces occasionally touch the edges of the living. In this telling, Clark was not chosen but attuned, able to feel shifts in the air that others ignored, capable of sensing changes that moved quietly beneath the surface of daily life. His disappearance, then, becomes part of the land's deeper story, a moment in which one life folds into the wilderness like a whisper into wind. They believe he did not suffer. They believe he understood something at the end that most people never glimpse. A third interpretation persists among the most traditional mountain families, that Clark's story serves as a caution about listening too closely to the shadows. They say that when a person pays too much attention to omens, the omens begin paying attention back. In their retellings, Clark's tale is one of imbalance, a young man who leaned too far into the unseen until it pulled him through. These families speak of him with respect, but also with warning. They tell their children to trust signs, but not to dwell on them, to honor the dead, but not to invite them, to listen to the land, but not to lose oneself in its whispers. No matter which interpretation a listener favors, the effect of Clark's story on Ozark culture is unmistakable. It shaped the region's understanding of intuition, grief, premonition, and the fragile line between perception and fear. It reinforced the cultural belief that some people walk with a sensitivity that others do not. It reminded families that silence can be meaningful, that stillness can be a language, that the woods sometimes hold their own kind of truth. And it taught, perhaps more than anything, that not every story ends with a body found or a mystery solved. Clark Hockensmith's name surfaces in local histories as a footnote, in genealogies as a question mark, in family stories as a lingering ache. But in the oral tradition of the Ozarks, in the slow, reflective voice of the elder storyteller, Clark is something else entirely. He is a reminder that some lives ripple outward long after they end, not with noise, but with quiet persistence. He is the figure standing at the edge of understanding, neither warning nor welcoming, but simply present, like a silhouette against a twilight ridge. And so this story closes not with certainty, but with a breath held between worlds. We know only what Clark left behind: a folded coat, a vanished trail, a troubled year, a life full of quiet intuition. The rest, what he felt in those final hours, what he heard in the trees, what he walked toward, is part of a silence that belongs to him alone. Some stories end with truth revealed. Others end with questions. Clark's ends with a space, the kind that asks us to listen softly to whatever the hills choose to say in their own time,